Welcome to Duncan Thorin Shields YouTube channel. I managed to con Duncan into convincing his friend to pay me thousands and thousands of dollars as a professional Counter-Strike player, so maybe he can convince you that some of his analysis is correct.
Right, this is going to be another episode of the Know-It-Alls of Counter-Strike. Where should we start?
Counter-Strike?
I mean, technically, it does expand beyond that, but since this show will only be largely about Counter-Strike, we'll just leave it at that, shall we? Actually, that's one of those areas. I'll tell you a little anecdote first, just because you might find this fun, and it's something that actually just like, I think fans like fun anecdotes if they're into the same personalities. Like, if you watch this show, you're not just watching it because it's a fucking podcast. Like, you obviously know me and Tommy here, and like, you must be interested in our thoughts. So I'll tell people a story. Right, back in the day, because I always tell people, I've realised, but I don't give the context to this. Maybe you can talk to this. You know, when people always ask me, like, why are you so hostile to pros? And wow, how can you disrespect them? Because they don't know, back in your day when you were a pro, mate, Pro players used to treat me like I was the dirt on the end of their shoe. Like, they made it like if they granted me an interview, I was like some fucking like fanboy that they were like, oh, they're being so nice. And meanwhile, like, I was already a 10-year veteran in the industry, you know, like trying to do, and you know this, I wasn't just doing throwaway shit. I was trying to do shit that could last and could be epic. I mean, sadly, SK Gaming deleted all of the fucking website, but I was trying to do like historic stuff, you know, shit that mattered. So what they don't know is, like, I always kept that in the back of my mind, that little chip on my shoulder. And I was like, listen, when I get to the top, like, fuck these guys. I'll actually give them, when I have the megaphone, basically, I'm going to let them all know just what I think of them in the same way they did. So the anecdote goes like this, right? Basically, when I was at one of these events, a guy who worked with me, I won't say who it was at one of these sites, one time, even this guy tried to take the fact that I knew like loads about Counter-Strike, and obviously he was like obsessed with the game and following it. Even he tried to spin that as though I was like a loser, even though he worked in the esports industry at the same event covering the game. So what he did, right, is he said some bad shit to me. Like when I was talking to some player or something, and I was like, yeah, and the way he played Inferno, you know, was like, and then he just turns to me, right, out of nowhere at this dinner in like front of everyone, and just goes, I bet you're one of those people who knows every player who played in 2001, but probably can't do your own shoelaces, trying to make out like I'm literally like that guy out of fucking Rain Man or something. Like, quite offensive, you know. But he did it in a way where it's like, because he was supposedly more social than me, he was basically trying to like alpha me in front of everyone and make me look like a fucking like little nerd, right? But what he didn't realise is I just like played it off cool, and I was like, nah, you know, I have stuff I'm interested in, and whatever I'm interested in, I just research it, you know, figure out a lot about it, and I just have a good memory. But he wouldn't just let it go, right? Because he thought like, oh, really? So this guy's going to try and fight back, is he? So he thought I was bluffing, right? So he goes, like, what? What else do you know then? And I said, well, listen, mate, like, let's not get silly here, but, you know, I like music, I like movies. And when I said movies, he thought, like, got him now. So then he goes, oh, yeah, what do you know about movies? And I said, it's quite similar to CS, you know, I tend to have a good memory for, like, you know, who was acted in the movie, who directed it.
I can already tell where this is going to go, because I remember one of the events we did a couple years ago, it was like you and Vendetta just like knew everything about every movie that's ever been made, like every fucking detail.
Oh, that's the funny thing, by the way. What this idiot didn't get was exactly what you just said there. Like, obviously, it's the same thing. When we played that game, we once played a game like at one of these tournaments behind the scenes where it was like sports and stuff, and any of our like specialist subjects, like the other hobbies we have. Yeah, me and Vendetta are ridiculous on how many like NFL players we can go through, NBA. Like, yeah, because the point is, if your mind works that way, it just works that way on everything. But what this idiot didn't know was he didn't get that, because obviously his mind didn't work that way. So when I said movies, he was like, oh. And I said as well, and you know, I could maybe even probably tell you the year it came out. So then he thought like, I've got him now. So then he was like, oh yeah, well what if I just said like a few movies then? You could tell me what year they came out. And what he didn't know was, that's literally, I haven't done it on purpose, again, it's just something like I'm into, and I just have a good memory for it. But that's even something I used to use as like sort of a parlor trick whenever I would be like, talking to girls and stuff, you know, just to like be a fun thing to like show off to them or whatever. So then I said like, yeah, I'd give it a go. And and this is the best part, right? Because secretly I know I've got it in my back pocket. I'm also downplaying this like a motherfucker. So I'm giving him hope that like he's going to catch me, right? But then here's the part this idiot didn't think about. And if anything, this summarizes the whole story, right? The movies he reels off are movies where like, I don't think many people would get the year, but you know what? They'd have a chance. Like, he's reeling off like Pulp Fiction, like the Untouchables, like, you know, The Matrix, like, because think about the real way he's actually like fucked himself in the catch-22 here is obviously he doesn't know.
Movies, so then, well, you know, you can go for the other ones.
And he doesn't know the really hard movies. So obviously he himself isn't a specialist in any area in his whole life. But in trying to invalidate me as one, he's actually made it too easy. So as you can imagine, when someone pulled out the phone and I reeled off, like, you know, the year Pulp Fiction came out, the year The Untouchable, and I got like all like 3 for 3. The best thing is, this guy just did one of those like things for a movie where they just sort of like do like a little gulp and then just like fucking like start talking about something else. Like, anyway, yeah, tomorrow I think we're going to like, so people don't even know the levels that this shit goes through. So actually, you know what? To bring it all back, I'm not lying, mate. In the areas I follow, I am a mad know-it-all. Like I do, you know, because the point is, it's like that fucking Larry Bird quote, isn't it? It's like, it's not trash talk if you can back it up. If you actually do know fuck loads, and you should be proud of that. You don't have to be, I know, listen, some Nordic people don't get this, but I was raised also similarly to be like, you never brag about what you're good at. You know, you shouldn't, because you might make someone else feel bad. You know, it's like, I learned that that's just some fucking social conditioning bullshit, mate. If you're good at something, just fucking say it. And if someone thinks they aren't, they can take a shot, can't they? They can come prove you wrong.
So just for some context on where the story originated, the reason that I think everybody, like, well, not everybody, but many people didn't think highly of journalists, I guess, like back in the day, so, you know, like 15 years ago, is that because a lot of those people didn't get paid. What ended up happening is many of those were people who just like fans and just like were doing the work just for the sake of like getting to the events and like seeing people, etc. So then you'd have a bunch of people who would come do like interviews and then just like try to befriend you effectively. Just for color.
No, by the way, I would agree on that regard. Like, that's the weird thing is I actually I sort of agree with that. Like, put it this way, a lot of the people back then, there's a reason they didn't stick. And it wasn't just that, like, they didn't want to do journalism. It's like, as you say, they were just like, some of them were glorified fanboys. And so once they finished the interview, well, the reason why you don't want to do the interview is because that fucker's going to come up to you at the after party and he's going to stand awkwardly near you and another player and then think because he did an interview, he's now your mate and start just like, you know, like this is where people really were bad as like nerds with social skills. They would do that thing where they don't introduce themselves. You're just talking to another player you know really well, like about, and maybe even about personal shit, dude. And then they just like sort of like turn and then just go like, yeah, and I've always thought that. It's like, what the fuck? Like, holy shit, dude, we didn't even invite you into this one. You know, like, mate, there were some bad people back then, I can't lie. But what people eventually realised about me was, I even had to, I won't say who, but like some super duper player once, like, this is when I could see they were starting to get it. He just once said like, why do you never go to the after parties? And I was like, well, first of all, have you ever seen what they're like? Like, aside from just drinking the alcohol, they're not exactly the most fucking banging parties.
I mean, once like you didn't have to worry about like paying the $100 or whatever going somewhere else. I think it became pretty obvious that you'd rather just like get your group of people and go somewhere else and just pay yourself.
Exactly.
Go, you know, like one thing you do learn in life is that the free alcohol never runs out. So there's no reason to just like rush after it. Just like do something what you actually want to do. Don't do the thing where you get something for free. It's usually not worth it.
Anyway, there's actually a topic we can spin this into though, because it's something, especially with your background in business, I wanted to talk about a little bit because I'm sure people just think this is one of those kicks where I've like found something out and so I'm tying it into everything I do because that's kind of how I like remember things and how I build it into my work. And also, like, my logic is the people who follow my content, you're sort of on a journey with me. Like, you're figuring out the shit I'm figuring out and you're seeing how it relates to what I thought about before. So one angle I've been pushing heavily, and actually, in light of the fact, if people don't know, you have like a minor ownership stake in ENCE, I thought this would be an interesting topic to talk about with you, which is a classic problem that still exists today from right back in your time as a player. So the obvious example would go like this. When the Poles would have like no organisation or some shit tier, like tier 3 organisation, obviously it doesn't change what they can do in the server. They would still win the major, you know, like famously they won, I think, 2 majors playing for like no-name orgs or something ridiculous. But what would happen is a fan would then think it's like sports, because obviously in sports, right, it's very unlikely anyone wins the fucking La Liga who's like some super small org. It's going to be like Real Madrid, Barcelona. It's going to be some enormous club, because in those sports, it does kind of like, it's the same with the NBA. Like the payroll, it's very rare that a team like on the middle to the bottom half of the payroll even has a chance to win the NBA title. Like you'd have to lock into some insane draft scenario to even have a shot at that. So basically what I'm getting to is a lot of fans, because they unfortunately at the moment still don't know the economics behind the teams, they just look in the server and they think, right, if this team's banging in the server, ENCE last year is a brilliant example because that team was in finals, obviously won a tournament, major final. Like they wouldn't know. If you actually know how much those people got paid and how fresh the org is, I think it's only existed for what, like 4 years now or something?
Yep.
that's actually called insane overperformance. Because the reason I bring this up now is, listen, because I obviously am a little bit biased. Like, I thought it was bullshit to cut Alexi B, and I thought it was maybe ego on the part of some players, and I did also sort of want to see them get the comeuppance and fail. Listen, I was on the train of make fun of ENCE for the first like 3 or 4 months, but then once I noticed like that's gone, and they've changed players anyway. Like, if anyone notices, there's only Alu left. Like, it's all gone. Like, there's no point talking about the whole team. It's not like it's just minus Alexi B, it's minus everyone now. I even think now people have gone too far the other way, mate. Like, now, if you actually look where ENCE is, that's even not unreasonable for where they are in the industry. Like, to get a little bit better would be nice. Obviously, you want better finished players. Like, that's your angle, get the best finished players. But if people understood the finances, it's actually mental that you were ever ahead of FaZe Clan, Vitality. Like, this is ridiculous, wasn't it, that overperformance?
Yeah, I mean, so Fnatic's doing the crowdfunding currently, right? So they've actually publicly put out their financials, which is like certainly one of the first time that anybody's put any numbers out. It's very high level. It's not like super informative, but you do get a sense of like where they are financially and have been financially for the last couple of years.
Can you give anyone a spoiler? What's the sort of cliff notes on that? I'm guessing not well, hence why they're selling parts of their org.
Just around like 10 million of revenue last couple of years, a little bit more lately, and then something like 5-7 million of burn annually. So they lose like 5 to 7 million a year. Makes
sense. I mean, if people don't know how much the salaries are, makes absolute sense.
Yeah, so that's obviously across like all the games, not just some parts of it and like all the other stuff that they do. Fnatic's also admittedly is a little bit of a bad comparison just because of Fnatic gear, and that's sort of like tied into everything else they do, and they don't separate that in the in the numbers that they put out.
Okay.
But like so comparison wise, like I know Mika, who's the CEO of ENCE, like he said this publicly. I think last year, what he said is did like something like 3 million of revenue. And lost no money. Like ENCE has been profitable every year since it started. Not like making money, profitable.
No, but that's amazing considering. When people add in CS:GO, Serral, like I think is it like Rainbow Sixes, your other game? Like that's pretty good. Like going in terms of like efficiency of running the business. Right? That's like a small market team in the NBA that just does a good job, makes the playoffs, and doesn't have to lose much money.
Yeah, I mean that's like certainly from a business perspective, like done super well. I think I do think the fact that it's an open circuit, which means that anybody can just like pay anything for anybody just to get the best players should they so choose. That makes it a little bit challenging sometimes to compete. Though of course, like you have to keep in mind that a lot of the biggest money pits. At least in the short term, are all the franchise leagues just from the franchise fee payments alone. So that like fundamentally changes the picture between the different companies, and that's honestly the biggest differentiator from just like cash needs between the different organizations.
Because the other end to this equation, I mean, this will now sound like I purposely set this example up just to be an arsehole and sound like even more obnoxious, but like. The people who are like, why do you go so hard on FaZe? It's like, guys, if you knew the money FaZe and org has, the money that they actually potentially even make, like they're one of the few orgs that I could believe makes like profit, obviously with all the lifestyle shit and all the stuff they have on the side with streaming. And then if you knew how much they paid their players, if you're going to go mad on ENCE for not being a fucking top 5 team in the world, when actually they have no business money-wise, it's just in the server if they get it super correct. Like last year. For me, last year was lightning in a bottle, mate. You just had the perfect mix of people in good form, good places in their career. At this point in time, I would even imagine the fact that they were like hadn't been at the top levels and they were hungry to play the tournament. It's like, I'm sure, like the point is you can't recreate that every single year. Like some years it's going to happen, some years it won't. The difference is if you're FaZe Clan and you have the backing and the power to get players that they do, there's pretty much no excuse for not being a top team. Like you have to almost, like I won't say mismanage because you can certainly make mistakes that you can't understand how they'll impact the server as an exec. We all know that. But they've they've clearly failed in that regard, if you know what I mean.
I think it's a good example of a team that I think I don't know how the inner dynamics of the team work, but like my strong sense is that Nico's word probably meant quite a bit in like with the roster changes that took place there, where I think like in many cases you might have been better off if you had somebody from the outside controlling it. But like you said, like for FaZe, like their business is like YouTube and like the lifestyle brand. Esports is like a nice little side hobby for them, for the company. Like they're not an esports organization the same way like all these other companies are. That's just like not their main business.
By the way, along those lines, I realise this is obviously a loaded question, not least because you know what I think, and then obviously you literally are like an executive now. But as someone, and maybe we can relate this to your playing days. You know, on like the one, I think it was on the first or second episode where I talked about that mad scenario where like your Finnish teams, like, here's the joke. You know that famous thing they say in all those like the poker movies and like if you sit at the table and you don't know who the fish is, it's you. Like my joke is that's what Finnish teams were like. If you don't know who the next person to be cut is, bad news, brother. Like they're all talking in the other private chats right now. It's you. Like that's the joke, isn't it? So along those lines, though, one of the things that me and you used to commiserate about is it'd be one thing if you'd actually been bad and you had been the player who was worse. But at certain times when they were trying to cut you or other players, it sometimes wasn't even to do with the game. It was just stupid shit where the other players get together. And it's like that British show, The Weakest Link, where the joke is sometimes they do vote off the guy who's clearly the best because there's three people left and the other two realise this guy will fucking murder both of us. Yeah, exactly. So that can happen. So the problem is, to me, it's so obvious when you look at how much money is being burned through by teams. We have to stop letting players decide. Like, I don't mind it maybe if you have some super influential in-game leader and he has like most of the say, but we can't be having this like a democratic approach. We can't be having the high school backstabbing. Like, it's just not a way to run a business. So what do you think on that angle? I know it's not as easy as that because hiring a GM is also its own trouble, but to me, just to be financially responsible, if you look at what a team like FaZe did, we've got to have someone who really carries the can on that. Because at the end of that whole equation, Nico basically just said, well, I didn't do any of it. No one could technically prove it. And then he just moonwalked out of there to a different team and helped them. Like, if I was FaZe, I'd be livid with that, mate. That's not the way I wanted my org to go after 3 years.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty challenging on all sides, to be honest, because, like, I can fully believe that some players think that they don't control it and like they don't demand changes. You know, like it's not like it's like when people say like, you know, LeBron doesn't make the changes in his teams. Like I'm sure he doesn't literally call didn't call like David Griffin in the Cavs or doesn't call Rob Pelinka now and be like, hey, like you're getting this guy or I'm out. Like he probably doesn't do that. But I'm sure, you know, a message comes across from somewhere that is pretty clear and like in what
put it this way,
and like, you know,
if you read enough news stories, it's going to definitely be, because this is how it'd be reported, isn't it? It's like LeBron's people told us, sir, that he would really prefer like to play with Rondo next year, and then that's effectively like, as you're saying, that he may as well have just called him at that point in time. Like it's just going to happen, isn't it?
Yeah. So I mean, look, like there's no like clear lines, and like I'm sure there are times when the players are like, oh, like I didn't think that I had like that opinion. There's like also other considerations. Like there are big player changes that have been made simply because somebody's contract is running out, like not too far from now, and they have all the leverage because they can say like, listen, like I'm not signing a deal unless like this move happens. Like I need this to happen, and like that happens like fairly commonly, at least based on what I've seen. Like that's like a real consideration in teams. On the GM side, I do think generally speaking, it's just like really hard to find people who are the right, like not the least because like there is like no clear formula. Like it's not like a job that has existed for a long time. Like people don't have track records.
There's no lifers as well.
And the way you build teams is so different because there's no substitutes, right? Like you can't just build a team of like 7 people and like keep shuffling folks in and out. I mean, suppose like in theory you can, but like we've seen with Astralis, like it's hard to find playing time for everybody. Like it doesn't necessarily work that way. And we've talked about this before, so there's no need to go into it. But like the fact that CS is so information heavy and it's a game without perfect information makes that really tough. I do think over time you do have to move more and more towards like the coach or the GM or whoever controlling the roster. And I think what was done with mibr is a good example of that. Now, before this call, nobody else will know this, but we had the chat open with Patrick from one of the previous episodes, and where there was actually some messages that I just read reading into it where he wanted to give me shit on the mibr performance the last couple of years, and he said like, well, I would say that like I wasn't in charge, which I wasn't. It's like I'm sure he'll take credit for this though, but I won't because I wasn't. But I mean, like that's like a good example of like at some point somebody just needed to say like this can't go on. Like it doesn't matter how bad the alternative potentially is, at least in the short term. Like it just can't go on. There's gotta be change. Like this is unacceptable how things are being done. So I mean, look, that worked out like better than anybody could have expected, at least in the short term. I think like realistically, I don't think anybody could have asked for like these results in the short term. But like that's like a pretty fundamental shift, and that it's pretty risky, not just from a performance perspective. You know, like if you look at the final couple of months of results, like the results were so bad that from that POV, you probably were going to break even regardless. Yes. But like there are other considerations, like, you know, there's sponsorships where
the whole package might,
right? Yeah, the whole package might be built around a single person who's the key man in the deal, and like if you get rid of that player, you might lose the entire deal. There's, you know, some fan bases are more or less built around certain players. Like I think it would be pretty hard to remove some players from certain teams. I think, by the way, Nico is probably one of those. One of those guys.
For sure.
Pretty synonymous with FaZe Counter-Strike, having been there basically from the beginning, I think.
No,
or at
he was
least
there
like almost from the beginning. Yeah.
A few years though.
Yeah, but like it's pretty hard to make that shift. But what I believe will happen is as more and more teams slowly, you know, whether because they know that they need to do it and they just have to do it or they can't avoid it anymore, I think more and more teams will end up doing that, and like over time that's where we'll end up. Because I think it actually creates like a nice checks and balances mechanism where when somebody else has power, the players are kind of forced to behave better and, you know, work together as a team, etc., a little bit better than like when it is just sort of a, you know, game of like who holds the most power currently.
Oh, by the way, even though, like, I know what you're referring to there, like Khan was saying there, like, effectively, the reason Khan brought that topic up and sort of was like, well, lurppis should take credit for mibr, because it was when that, like, announcement came out that I was going to consult with Guild, and like everyone else who didn't think that through, he thought that meant, like, I'm sort of the GM of Guild and I'm building their team. So what he thought was, like, you know, now all three of us will, like, shit-talk each other and we'll go back to the old days of bantering, which I can't lie. Here's the thing. That's not at all what's happening. As you just said, it's basically only Khan that's even vaguely in that position. But I can't lie. One day in the future, if I ever do become a GM or something, that will be one of the most fun elements of it and satisfying is the fact that I'll be battling like Khan, Henry G, could be Moses by then, could be Ankle, could be all these people because these are the obvious people hire for the job. So I even think, by the way, if anyone's thinking, but that's weird, wouldn't you all be enemies though? Why would you ever get together and laugh about it? It's like, I'd maybe just look into how like business and politics works. Like if you imagine all those people are just like hating each other at big dinners and galas, like you don't know like what the WWE is like. That the stuff in the rings for sure, guys. Like that's the, you know, behind the scenes, they'd rather have a beer with each other exactly than fucking battle each other. Like you just do that because it's sport, it's competition, isn't it?
Yeah.
All right, what about this then? One topic you brought up there, it's quite an interesting one, we could go on a bit still, is obviously you don't have to make it specific to mibr, but I think mibr is a pretty good example. There's another reason why it's so tricky to allow players to make their choices. Because, for example, first of all, someone could be a brilliant player but not have great sense in who they want as teammates. Like, mate, I've seen that in sports a lot of the times. Like, you should see some of the players before they got, like, Pau Gasol that, like, Kobe Bryant wanted. Like, he wanted people that were, like, borderline all-stars, because what would happen is the season before, he'd have seen them, maybe he played, like, 2 good games against them, and he was like, get me this guy. Like, that was why he was, like, demanding a trade. And the sad thing is this, all the fans like me who were, like, feeling sorry for him not having help, mate, it would have been way worse for them if they'd have gotten some of the players he wanted. Like, some of those guys, like, I'll give you an example of one. One that he demanded that he wanted was Carlos Boozer. Now, Carlos Boozer was like a borderline all-star for a couple of years, but like I think something like 3 years later he was just done. Like, you know, he was like, wasn't even vaguely good. So like, imagine if you've hitched the next 5 years of your career to that guy. Whereas instead, obviously, what the Lakers did was his GM was shrewd. Like, he thought his GM was doing nothing. He didn't know his GM was waiting for the right deal to pull the trigger on, so that you don't, as we all know in the NBA, do the Carmelo deal and give away like half your fucking team, but then you get a good player, but it's like 2 players can't win the whole league, you know. So along those lines, like if I don't want to use mibr, the old example was NIP. One of the problems with those sorts of teams is they either have a really weird taste in the players they want, or even when they get them, they don't envision, well, I'm not going to use him the way he was used in the team that impressed me. Like, I think that was an example I would say for mibr. Most of those pickups were legit players. They were all people who looked good elsewhere, but for whatever reason, the players in mibr, whoever made these decisions, just brought them in, and it was like the old NIP foreman where they rotated the 5th spot. Was it the Poison Chalice one? It's like, you thought you were joining NIP, you weren't. You were just joining to do whatever shit they had left over.
Yeah, I mean, I think like if you look at TRK's performance individually, like that's a pretty good example from the previous team. Like he was just like a very, very average player on that team, and he's looked like a star in many of these games against like good teams now. I mean, like, look, it's like, I think one of the problems with some of these teams where they've had the same core for such a long time is that it's almost impossible to reinvent yourself at some point. Like unless you bring somebody else to like run the ship entirely and you kind of reboot everything, like it's just almost impossible to like kick all the old habits and like start from scratch. And if you're not willing to do that, then by default, like you're gonna force a lot of players to do things that they're not comfortable and or necessarily are not good at. And more likely than not, like, you know, the way the calendar works, like there's no good time to make roster changes, right? Like there's always something right around the corner. So you either basically just like forfeit some number of tournaments where you just say like, listen, like we're not going to be ready in time. Like we're not going to be good. We're just going to play and probably lose. And then we'll try to be better sometime later on. Or you do the thing that like, I think 9 out of 10 teams do, which is like, well, like we're going to try to fit everything the best way we can today, and we're going to try to win tomorrow, and then we'll optimize. And when you do that, you know, you usually start off on the wrong foot. You start off in the wrong positions, and it's just really hard to get anywhere from there. And by the way, like that in some ways it's also why sometimes you get like these honeymoon periods in new teams when the players do fit from the beginning, because everybody's working well together, and it's like, you know, they fit in the right places. But usually those are the times when you don't get like the crazy returns anymore on top, because you already fit from the beginning. So like you don't have to do the great work that's going to take you months, but will make you better still over time. Is you'll get much better in like adjusting for things. You know, you'll have like plan B's, or rather like plan C's and D's on everything, because you can just kind of go back on your playbook like, hey, like this thing that we ran at this big tournament, you know, 6 months ago, like let's do that now. And people will generally like at least have a sense of what that is, and you'll just have much more depth to your game. But I'd say that's generally the big difference. And like that's why it's just hard to make some of these teams work by just like swapping out the fifth guy. And it often would be better to just like swap out 2 players at once, if for no other reason except that it kind of forces you to rethink things and like how everything functions.
I mean, another angle, in my opinion, why the honeymoon period exists, and funnily enough, the old nip, the 4-man changing the 5th man's another example, because think about it, right? The first 3 months with every player was always fire when they went from like fucking Makalele to Alu to Pit or Pith, however you said his name. Like, mate, these moves were all working. But the point is, there's another angle people don't think about, right? When your team starts to drop off in results, which is always what necessitates the roster move when you were a top team, what happens is, for the first month or two, when they bring in the player, well, obviously everyone gets it that like it can't just be that guy, so we've got to fix things as well. So initially they will be like, well, maybe I'll play this spot, or I'm going to reinvent myself. Like when Get Right was like, I'm going to be an entry player now. It's like, mate, that's how you know like they knew that it was the end of the road. It's like when he was willing to swap his whole playing style. But the problem is this. That's great in the early days, and especially if you get those wins, like you're saying, in the honey period. But let's see what happens 4 months down the line when you start losing, and then you're losing all those close games, and then maybe the guy you brought in has a couple of bad games. That's where someone just eventually says, when they've got the veterancy and they can kind of have this pull, I think I'll have my old spot back. And you know what? You're doing this now. You know, that's when you sort of see where the levers of control are.
Yeah, and also, by the way, like that's generally where people will default to. So, you know, like if, like, let's say in a team dynamic where it's the players who decide where, like what the roster changes are, who's going to be playing, not like directly, but, you know, sort of indirectly hold the control over that. You know, if you feel like you are on thin ice and results aren't good and like something's going to have to change, you might feel inclined to push to get back to your most comfortable roles, even if that's like not the right move for the team, because that'll help you look better, which might help you stay on the team for longer, which is like another, you know, sort of weird consideration that kind of ruins the team's development to some extent.
Yes. I mean, by the way, because again, I can tie this in, because one thing I think is cool about what we can do on this show is we can sort of allude to or tell anecdotes, especially if we don't put all the names in, that people would be shocked by it, because we're obviously insiders for a long time within Counter-Strike specifically. So an example I'll give people, I'll tie into a sports example, because again, I know you love to read all the books and the biographies, so what you always find behind the scenes is, it's like, this is why I hate it when fans think that like any successful team like get along, etc. It's like, mate, if you even read the great sports biographies, the amount of arguments that go on that just never made the light of day. So I'll give you a good one, right? Everyone famously knows that the Lakers with Shaq and Kobe, obviously there was a power dynamic there, and who was in charge and who wanted to be, or did Kobe want to be like advanced further than his career was, and was Shaq still the top dog? You know, there was all that shit. But here's what people don't know. That really is known because that was the era when media completely popped off. It was the digital age. What people don't know, I think you read the book where it mentions some of this, is when they had the Lakers in the 80s, well, what do you mean, Thorin? That was the one where they all loved each other. It's showtime, and there's Cap there, and of course he loved little Magic, his little body there. Right, first of all, if you imagine that Kareem liked the fact that Magic came in and played that one game in the finals and got the fucking MVP for the whole finals when Kareem was like the better player of the whole series. Like, first of all, if you're the best player in the league, you're never like giving away MVPs. By the way, like, it's like that story back in the day where they gave fucking Nixon from HLTV that MVP. Like, listen, Get Right's a great guy. He'll never say it publicly, but if I won the tournament and I was Get Right, I'd be like, listen, I like stories and everything, but give me that fucking MVP. So basically the story is this: even though that team was so dominant in the 80s, right, because Kareem was like the best player in the whole league when it began, right, if you drafted Magic Johnson to any other team in the NBA, from day one you tell him, it's like LeBron, it's like, you're the best player. In fact, the whole thing's about you've got to learn how to be the best player. Just, sow your wild oats, try and score as much as you can, limit test, learn your game. Instead, in his team, the reason why all his MVPs come at the end of the 80s is when he came in, his job was like, listen, you're really good, but it's his team. It's Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. So there's literally a point, it was in like the mid-80s, where like eventually, because there were loads of championships, Pat Riley actually had to literally go to Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who I think at this point was like 35 or something, and say like, listen, mate, listen, you obviously are a legend and everything, you're going to break all the records, but like, it's got to be his team now. Like I think the phrasing he used was like, it's time to give him the keys to the car, as it were. Now, to a fan, they would think like, what the fuck is that? Like some high school shit. It's like, no, that's what happens with the egos of star players. So like, dude, that's a real consideration in these teams. Like, you can put a young player who should be the star on the team, but the players themselves might not agree with that.
Well, I mean, that's how the Cavs team died, and like I've had some conversations about this, because like at the time, like I was rooting for LeBron's team against the Warriors in those finals, and like of course like that gets pretty depressing pretty quickly, and like just because the Warriors might have been the greatest team of all time in the KD year, so the final Kyrie year, like Cavs were really good that year.
Yeah, they were amazing.
Like you kind of forget like how they just destroyed everybody, because you kind of think back to the regular season when like they're just not trying.
Yes.
But like that's where that team died. Like if Kyrie doesn't get injured in that OT of Game 1 of 2015 Finals, if two bounces go differently in 2017, like they could have had a three-peat. Instead, like couple things shake out a little bit differently, and like Kyrie's like, all right, I want it to be my team, so like I'm out, and like look at his career since.
Yes. Oh, it's basically the direct equivalent of when I always say, like, they can say otherwise, and obviously Carrigan's not going to say this because he has to construct his own reality to live in and be able to cope with this. But, like, let's be real. If when it's 15-11 and FaZe against Cloud9, the Boston Major final, they just win the next round and they win the major together, and all those players who've never won a major look at Carrigan and go, Captain, my captain, you fucking led us to a major. Mate, he'd be in the team right now. Like, they'd still be playing together right now. Like, it's just the way sports are, isn't it? Like, the problem is those peak moments of your career, to us, they're just a moment, but like that everything hinges on that.
Yeah, and by the way, like you can even trace that back further. Like if they win from that 12-6 lead against NIP at IEM Oakland, like 4 months prior, that was the one where it started. That was the first one that they threw from having like a big lead, because before that they destroyed New York. They won like 16-5 on average in every game. Like I bet you if they make one different call, they don't lose that one like one on two to exist, they win that game, I bet they win the major, they win a bunch of those other tournaments, and like I bet Counter-Strike looks very different to today.
You know what? I'm going to make a statement that'll probably shock people right now. And here's the thing. The amount of shit I talk, that actually means something when I say that. Like, because obviously I don't give that disclaimer for the most ridiculous opinions I give that people get mad about. But here's a statement I'll make, because it's a thought I've been thinking about recently. Basically, I've got a video I'm going to do in League of Legends that's about this, where because in League of Legends, they have so many players and they only have like the one franchise league in each major region. It means there aren't enough spots for how many good players there are. There's loads of basically like tier 1 level talent. And because there's only 10 teams with 5 spots each, where you can imagine like there's players basically where like for example, this is no joke, there's a player that's not going to be signed for this next LEC season who was probably like 5th best in the league at his position. And the reason why is, at the moment, because of the finances of the league, there's tons of teams would rather gamble where it's like, well, since you're like the 5th best, but you're not the best, I'll gamble on like a cheaper rookie, and then I roll the dice and maybe he does turn out to be 2nd best and I've sort of gained, right? So the angle I've come up with to argue against that, because I think that's like an example of where they've taken it too far. Like, I would agree, if we're talking about the 8th fifth best player at his position, that gamble might make sense. But the reason why it doesn't for the fifth one is your actual chances that this rookie is everything that you could have gotten from that player isn't very high in that first year. And so the point I think that people have misunderstood is this. You can have a lot of skill at a game. It can manifest in the game. Like if you put a player in a certain spot against a random opponent, you see this all the time in the NFL. In the first season, they can look really good. But there's a certain period, I would say it's maybe 3 or 4 years into a career, where a player not only has the skill, but more importantly, it's like, I know it sounds simplistic, but he understands how to win the game. And that is very different from being just good at the game. And so my point is this. When a player knows how to win the game, it's also why sometimes you keep around a veteran whose skill isn't even that good anymore. So you know what? Exist is the perfect example, mate. Because individually, he's only degraded over the last 4 or 5 years. Like, if you just go look at his stats, mate, even in phase, they were atrocious. It was like not just red numbers on HLTV. It was like, you know, he was having like 0.5 ratings and shit. But there'll be certain scenarios you'll put Exist in, probably even now, where he'll just win a ridiculous 1v1 that you're like, you know, the eye test tells you there's no business winning this. Like, there's something about like game knowledge like that. That's why I don't want people to think like this era of you recruit the hot FPL players is the way to go entirely either. Like, there's a certain type of veteran will always have value in these games.
There's I think that the way to maybe put it is like the smart veterans that you have, like they're probably not going to do the dumb things that lose you the game. So like, you know, if the rest of your team is good, like they'll be there and like they'll do their part, and then like the best players on the team will decide whether you win or not. But if you pick,
which is underrated,
if you pick the youngsters and you bet on them, like they actually can lose you the game. You know, they might put you over the top, though it's like far less likely, but they actually can just lose you the game, like almost regardless of what the top players do. And so, you know, like then it just depends on like how good is your team. Like, you know, if your team is super top heavy, you have a couple of the world's best players, then like I think FaZe is a good example of when they picked up Cold Zera. Like that's probably the kind of team where they would have been better with Kjærby from day one. Not to say like Kjærby is like the great right type of veteran, but like that's a team where you want to have not like youngsters, like regardless of like how skilled or how good they are, but rather just somebody who's already been there and done that. Because like if Cold
just to clarify, by the way,
Cold and Nico play well, like, you know, they can win you tournaments almost themselves.
Right there, I hope people understand, because like that actually sounded a bit confusing. You didn't mean pick up Kjærby instead of Cold. You meant pick up Cold and then instead of like, you know, biomass and that like recycle, you just go with Kjærby initially. Right?
Like once you have Nico and Cold, like just pick up, you know, sort of like washed veterans, and I think in some ways you'll do better, because then it just relies on the top players and they'll give you a chance. But you know, the top veterans are probably not going to lose you the games.
I mean, I would say, especially if you watch the NBA, this is so prominent. Like the reason why that is a league where like 1 or 2 stars is all you need. This is the one thing one thing I love about esports is, because I know the way you like to watch it as well, is when we watch esports now, we're no longer watching just because a game is on. We want to watch like the great players, and we want to follow them like we would follow a great sports star, like because the interesting narrative of their career and what they do to succeed and stuff. So one of the things I've noticed is all the great players teach you something about the game if you sort of have the eyes to see it, if you can learn from what they went through. So I'll tell everyone, I've said this many times, every time I would look on paper and just look at the eye test of how good the players are, I'm not joking. If you go back, there's almost 0 majors those polls of Neo and Taz should ever win. Like on paper, they're almost always that much.
0. It is 0. It's not almost 0. It is
Dude,
0.
They're almost always playing like the best fucking Swedish team that's like stacked with talent every time. So another thing I learned about Counter-Strike very early, thanks to those guys, is Counter-Strike isn't about stack as much talent as you can and make it work for you. It's like you need just enough skill with everything else included. And so the good thing about the polls is they were so well-rounded elsewhere. People did their job. They had the map pool. Somehow they had this fucked up chemistry that sort of did work, but then didn't as people. And then the key thing was they had just enough skill. I mean, it did not have them the best player ever, but you know what I mean? Like they never had an all-star team ever.
No, I mean, that was like, no matter how you looked at it, it's just like a low-skilled team, but they played, they just played super smart. I remember having this one conversation with Taz actually on sort of like a related topic. This was like when I was playing with WinFact, which is the last team that I played for before I quit playing. And it was like one of these tournaments that we played in. I want to say it was in Kiev, like at the Cyber Arena. I was talking to him there. It was one of those games where like I think I want to say like we started off pretty well. We're up, you know, like 5-0, 6-0, like Nuke T side. We got a bunch of entries and then just like lost a lot of close rounds as you do against those guys, and then like wound up losing. And I was talking to him like later on at the event or something, and he made some comments saying like, listen, dude, like if only we had the skill to like actually get the entries instead of just like knowing what the tricks are that let you win more of the like 3v3s at the end.
Yes.
Which is like which is true, because like the most distinctive thing, if you think back to the particularly like the 1.6 days of that core, is like the one famous way how they used to always win like the rounds that you're just not supposed to win is like they'd have like a 2v3 against a much better team, and then like instead of going together and like trying to trade kills, which obviously doesn't work, like you need somebody to do something, they always did this thing where they like split apart on the completely opposite sides of the map, and then basically just like, you know, spun the roulette wheel on one of those guys getting a kill, and if he did, then there's a rotation, and then like that completely catches you off guard because they play so differently from everybody else. And that was like a very famous thing that they always tended to do.
That's also, by the way, a perfect example of how a veteran beats someone who's more skilled than him. I mean, mate, you see this all the time in the NBA. Like, if you notice, the position that people always miss in the NBA, that ages like fine wine, is really good passing point guards. Dude, they can lose all their speed. Sometimes their shot even goes.
Rondo.
Yeah, and the whole point is they just know every angle. They know like how to like fake a guy out. They know how to like draw a guy in and make them think they're going to shoot, even though they're definitely not going to. Like, they just know all the little tricks, don't they? Like, they're not anything more playing off skill anymore. Like, they're just using their brain. Like, they're just chess players at that point, aren't they?
Yeah, no, I mean, like, Rondo's a good example, and like I didn't think he was going to be good on that team like this year's playoffs, and like, you know, he was like borderline unplayable when he was playing, then he was injured. And then, like, you know, he's going to get paid now because he played really well. Because it just doesn't require size, doesn't require anything, just requires you to be smart. I think he even had a bunch of comments in that vein where he basically said, like, I'm just trying to play chess.
Yeah. I would even say, by the way, here's one of those statements that might offend people, but I think it's just accurate, right? One thing that triggers me is I hate it when they do that thing where, because players themselves, what they really mean by, like, I'm the best player is exactly what we're talking about. It's like, listen, I've learned all the tricks, I know the game. But the problem is when you talk about like the best player, often what you mean is like the most skilled player. That's what most people tend to mean that shorthand for. So, you know, famously, even when they're at this age of their career, people like LeBron and Kobe will be like, I'm just at my best now. Like, I'm getting better if anything. It's like, listen, dude, I saw you when you were in like 2010 or whatever. Like, the physical peak you were at then, like, nobody could ever stop you. You could go to the basket every time you wanted. Like you were just unstoppable. So, like, the point is, you might score as many points now, but you're doing half of that with your brain. Like, again, you just know exactly when to do the pass and when to dominate.
It's different. Like, if you think of the Miami years for LeBron, like, he just scored at will basically after the first year.
Yeah.
You know, like he just did whatever he wanted at will. Like, he still basically does it. Like, particularly like these playoffs, like he was just insanely good after the first round, during which he didn't play that well in the first games. But like it's not like he does like all the hardest things. He can still get to the basket. He just can't do that, you know, 10 times a game because he doesn't have the energy and like can't play that same way the whole game, which he previously could. But like he makes it look so easy in other ways because he's just always in the right place, like knows what to do, knows what the next play is, which is the part that he didn't have before. So obviously it feels easier. You know, it's sort of like the equivalent of like when you're starting as a, you know, in Counter-Strike, like you have to work much harder in the beginning because like you basically just have to out-aim people a lot of the time or like play differently because you're not going to be better. Like they're gonna have gone through that like all the situations 10 times more. They'll have more experience playing those tournaments, etc. So like what it comes down to is you have to find another way to win. You know, you have to differentiate somehow. You're not beating them at their game if they're better than you. So, and then over time, like as more and more of your game, just like almost by default, frankly, like shifts over to you just doing the right thing and playing the right way, which goes back to our point about veterans like exist. You rely less and less on your aim, which is why players tend to sort of develop a different playing style over their careers. And like that's also why when you're coming up, if you're someone like Zaibu, like you probably, I'm guessing, I don't know, but I'm guessing he plays a lot because like that's how you get that kind of aim, similar to Simple, and like that's how you have the skill to just like rely on that kind of playing style. Whereas somebody else, like they just are in the right place at the right time and they get the slightly easier kills. Like they're not going to get the same peak ever, there's no chance, but like the work required, because most of it comes from experience, is significantly less to just maintain their level.
Yes, that's also the other thing that makes Counter-Strike such a fascinating game, because obviously we have like a handful maybe a couple of handfuls at the top tier of people who are like 24 and above, who again are playing this veteran role, or maybe some of them still have some of their skills and could be good. And then we have all these people aged 17 to 21, where sometimes it's not even based on age. It's like you say, experience. So I'll give you an example. When I did this show recently with Carrigan, where I was sort of talking about him going from TSM team / Astralis to FaZe Clan and then going to Mouse. Well, part of the reason why it took so long in Mouse to get that properly online as like a potentially top team is because all those other teams those players are ready to just be like the best. Like they've already got their game and it's like they're just learning. So for example, in TSM he still had his issues that he had amazing skill, but they couldn't always apply it in the big moment. We all know that. FaZe Clan, maybe he had a nice mix of it. When he came to Mouse, basically, well, think of the composition he got in Mouse, because obviously he didn't get the Sonny Oscar lineup. He got the lineup where his veteran is Chris J. Woxix played a few years, but for a team where, as far as I can tell, they had no structure, and he's just like, and also he's never been finals. You know, he was in like a playoffs, maybe, if he's locked.
Yeah, like a DreamHack Open, semi-finalist.
Yes. And then he has two players who are both young and inexperienced. So at that point in time, it's like, mate, forget just getting these guys to like play well in the game. I almost have to teach these guys Counter-Strike so we can play the game. Whereas if you go into a different squad now, like that juicy story everyone's seen where maybe Carrigan goes back to Mouse in the ultimate fucking soap opera move of all time. Well, the point is, if he comes in now, mate, people like Rain and Cold Zero, he's not going to be like, right, I'm going to have to really work on these guys. He's going to be, this is the dream for me, man. I know exactly what I'm doing with you. I can't wait to get work with you, Cold. Like that's like coming along. It's like the joke of like when he joined FaZe, I said this. It's like, that's like someone just threw you the keys to like a slightly broken down Lamborghini. It's like in that scenario, if you just tune it up a bit, you got a Lamborghini, haven't you?
Yeah, I mean, also, by the way, like that's where the type of leader you are can help or hurt that, because I think like he has gotten teams to work like relatively quickly anyway, even with Mousesports, I think. But like my guess is that he's like a pretty hands-on type leader, and like sort of like, the joke I used to make back in the days with some of the players that I won't name here and you're aware of, is like I used to joke that I used to play on their keyboards too, because like they wouldn't know where to go for early picks, what to do. So I tell them where to go, what to do, and then like sort of almost like move two pieces in game. Like if you can do that, you can get over a lot of that, but like that's super taxing. So like if you have an inexperienced opper, for example, that's like the kind of role that's actually very easy to like tactically move around the map. Like you play like, let's say you play train CT, you might have them play Z one round, you might have them go up alley one round they might push top ramp, and like you can just kind of see where they are, and you can kind of move everybody, like tell everybody else where to go. It doesn't matter if you have one player like that. That's relatively easy to shift. You won't be able to do that in like late rounds, etc. Not all the time anyway, like that would be too hard. But like some types of players you can shift around pretty effectively, particularly in the early round, and like kind of get them in the right situations where they're going to be there at their best. But it becomes much harder if the leader and the team isn't that type. So I think FaZe is probably a good example. Like my guess is that Nico was the kind of leader when he was calling, where he said like, listen, like we'll do default and we'll look for picks, and then he'll say like, listen, we'll do the cat execute, or like we'll do a B split now. And like if the people don't know what to do in between, like what the right things to do, how to look for picks safely, etc., how to stay alive, like how to gain map control without taking on risk, like that's where it can like really blow up.
Yes. As in, obviously, Nico himself takes for granted. Like that's a simple concept to him.
Yeah,
like,
well,
essentially.
I mean, for some of these people, like like it's like some of this is domain specific, but like the best players who are just like super smart about the game, like they're just smart. They're not like dummies who just like somehow managed to get happy, like very lucky in that. Like they might not have like applied themselves when it came to like school or something. But like the people who are very smart about this stuff, like they're smart because they're smart in general. The thing where people make a big deal about LeBron having like photographic memory, where he talks about like this happened on defense, then like he got the ball, then he passed over here, I looked at who's open, and then decided like this was the best move because they were going to do that, and that was going to be the rotation. Like that's how everybody thinks who's like a smart player in all these games. That's not like the way if you read ESPN, you would think that's like 1 in a billion, and like LeBron's like the smartest player on the planet. Like no, like I guarantee you, like in the current top teams, like most of them have at least one player who could run you through like all the rounds. Like the map ends, they celebrate whatever, shake hands, and they go over and like, oh, that 8th round where you did that, I heard that sound and I thought they were doing this because of the scream that happened, and then this happened, this. Like that's how people think. So when you are someone like that, so let's say if you're Nico, if everything is so obvious to you, like not only can it be super frustrating when like somebody else just like doesn't see that, like they just don't know like how to see that. They just can't connect the dots. But also, like it can be really hard to figure out like what they don't understand, because like it's so glaringly obvious to you.
Yes.
It's like I just can't understand you.
Yeah, and when you say that as well, oh, fuck, what was the example I was going to give there? Oh, I know exactly another example that we can give on this. Right, mate, even though I definitely enjoy listening to Tony Romo's commentary, dude, the people give it fawning over this guy because he was making the calls. Again, if you think any legendary quarterback in that scenario, especially one who like was a smart guy who could do the post pocket read and know like I hate to break it to you guys, like he isn't a unicorn. Like you could probably get like 20 guys at least that could all do that. Some of them, by the way, might be even better.
Yeah. He's just presentable and willing to do it. But yeah, I mean, it is, you know, it's night and day with everybody else, obviously. But like I'm sure how like all the good, like great quarterbacks think.
Yes. I thought
there are also things he doesn't see, and that's why he wasn't. That's why he wasn't like Brady, for example, or some of the other guys, like Rodgers, etc.
Yeah. So the one last thing I thought I'd ask you about to tie this in, and obviously we'll wrap the show, is this. What about if we tie it back to when you were in IGL? Because one of the things that I find interesting, like I say about all my journey through Counter-Strike, is I don't pretend like I knew all this in the first year and I've just applied it for 19 years. Like every year I'm figuring out some of this shit. Or I'm even realizing like I sort of like vaguely knew something back then, but I didn't have it fleshed out. Like I hadn't thought about the other angle. So I'm sure during your playing days, I remember this happened a few times, there was times where you got the next good player, but the problem is you got them on year one. You know, and like actually it's not going to be till year 3 that they figure some of this shit out, right? So what happens is, what always happens when you have the IGL like that is, in the scrim, that guy's killing it, he's looking great. Like, I mean, we could obviously make the joke about someone who won like a 1v4 in like 2011 on it. Again, that's an in-joke over there, but it's a thing, and it convinced someone that he's a good player.
Someone's going to link this to Patrick.
And basically, you know, it convinced him that he was already good. Whereas like, yeah, obviously what you find out when you play the tournaments is like, well, now you find out all the flaws, right? So what was that dynamic like when you were the IGL?
I mean, look, I think if I knew what I knew in 2012 and like 2006, I think we would have won a lot of tournaments that year. Like that's safe to put. I think that sort of the part where I realized perhaps the most that like I developed in like how I think about the game is like, one, like, you know, all those Finnish teams, like I led the team, like everything we ran, like I called, etc. But at the same time, like those were in teams that like you could. By the way, like we dry run things on a server, etc., like doing all that stuff. But those were in teams where like you could just run defaults and like people would know what to do and they wouldn't overextend. So like we couldn't play that way, so we didn't. And like you couldn't teach people to play that way because they didn't necessarily want to be taught to play that way or want to think about the game that way. So when I joined EG, that was the first time when, you know, their playing style was that. So that's where you actually got to play that way and, you know, think of it as more like a chess game and like moving people around. The problem, of course, was that like, you know, Jordan was still nothing, you know, like he was like a really young player. You'd think of him as sort of like one of like the old veterans now. But he was like, I think he was 17 maybe when I joined, or, you know, just turned 18, something like that. So like he was like a very inexperienced young kid, like famously, you know, he always thought that his mouse felt off when we were playing on a stage. That was like the thing. And the joke is that he'll tell you the same thing as I used to tell him, like, Jordan, it's like all in your head. He's like, yeah, but I'd like my head to be in the right place. Which is like
that's a good line. You know, it's a good line.
Like, yeah, you know, it's fair enough, but like doesn't really help you. But like, so like he was someone that needed. Like you needed to kind of hold his hand a little bit so that he wouldn't do like dumb stuff when he was like figuring it out. At the same time, like you can't do that all the time because he doesn't learn. So I think he developed pretty significantly. But then the other player was, you know, like Danny was like, he's just the most passive player that you could ever see. Like if you watch how he played, that's why like that was his style. Like he played the lowest risk spots and got like all the easy kills you could ever get. Which made him good, but like you'd get a lot more out of him if you just kind of get him out of his shell. It's like he was one of those players who did kind of have to like shift around every now and then. Like if you look at any of those old EG clips from like early 2009, here's what he did on train every round. He went to Z and he stayed he didn't even go to the front of the Z on train CT side. He stayed in the back where there's like the teeny crack where like you can never ever die no matter what happens. Like nothing bad can happen to you. You can't really do much to help anybody either unless somebody literally stops there, but it's like a free roll. Like you can only benefit, but it doesn't really help your team. It's just like really good for you. So like he was one of those guys that you just needed to kind of like move around a little bit. And then like once he like he also enjoyed playing that way more, but like his nature just wasn't doing that. And then when I joined, like when I created WinFact after that, or Pice did, I guess at first, Aslak was like, just like completely kid out of nowhere. I think he was 17 at the time. Like he was like famously like super nervous about stuff. Like he took like meds at school for exams because like he would get nervous like taking exams. And he actually learned to get over his nerves from playing Counter-Strike, because like at first, he's one of those guys to be like great in scrims, like really good just playing, doing whatever he wants. And like we'd go to a tournament and like he'd basically just lock up. Because like he just wouldn't, like he just feels super nervous, like couldn't know what to do. And he actually ended up getting over his nerves in like a couple of months, because we actually just tried to be like, listen, like you just do the same shit. Like we're not going to complain if you do dumb stuff and die, but we are going to complain if you just like sit back holding a corner you would never hold online. Like that's not going to be acceptable. But he actually ended up getting over that in like a couple of months. So like in that fall we went to like 5 tournaments in October, just like tons of travel. And he actually got over that, like applying to everywhere else too. So like he sort of like fixed himself mentally from playing Counter-Strike, or like whatever the block was that like caused him to get super nervous. So like that's like a good example of, I think in the early days, like if I knew what I knew later on, say like I think Ruit would have been one of those guys that you could have potentially like, reined in just like the right amount. Because I think he was a bit like nothing, in the sense that those are like probably the 2 most talented players that I ever played with.
Sure.
So like if you could have, just kind of like directed that all that energy a little bit better, you probably would have gotten like significantly better results. And then I think like how, like what we got out of that WinFact roster, I think like, again, like if you think about like the kind of players that we picked up from day one and like what the budget on that team was, etc., is I think also pretty remarkable.
Yes, you actually inadvertently brought it all full circle there at the beginning of the episode.
Yeah, back to the beginning.
This video was kindly supported by Pronogo, Mohammed, Alabdul, Razzaq, Dean Tanglis, James Pederson, VatriSam, ErikHillestad, Andreas Kroknes, Hades, Zoomba Gaming, JDubs, Tobias Bernasconi, and Alexander Rao. Special thanks, as always, goes out to Jerky's Minion. Would you like to suggest a topic or a guest for one of my upcoming episodes? Maybe you want to ask more of those questions in that video AMA I do each month. Do you want teasers? Find out who the next guests are for my shows. Well, maybe you even want to take part in one of those crazy donated discussions where we go all over the place. If any of these perks appeal to you, or you want to support the channel, put your money where your mouth is and join the Illuminati today at the Patreon link in the description box below.